After completion of this mandatory training, you should be able to answer these questions. How often does abuse or neglect occur? Who are mandated reporters? What does child maltreatment look like? When should I make a report? How do I make a report? What happens after a report is made? In the online instruction that follows, we will provide you with the information you need in order to answer these questions. Mainly as a result of a few high-profile incidents, child abuse has become the center stage in the media. In response to incidents and also the failure of some to report incidents, our state legislators have mandated this training. Let us take a few moments and look at numbers to increase our awareness about the frequency of child abuse. Not a single child should be abused. Of concern, however, are recent data suggesting that the abuse of children is taking place at a higher rate than we had thought of previously. For example, recent statistics tell us that the abuse rate for children under the age of 5 is approximately 14.8%. Think about that for a moment. That's nearly 1 in 7 children. And we know this type of abuse doesn't stop magically when a child enters elementary school. Mandated reporters are individuals who are mandated by law to report known or suspected instances of child maltreatment. They are primarily people who have regular contact with children throughout their employment. People who work in schools are mandated reporters because they have regular contact with children as a result of being on school grounds. There are 44 specific categories of persons who are classified as mandated reporters. While this list includes people not normally associated with schools, like police, EMTs, and clergy, the list virtually includes anyone who works at a school either as a teacher, a staff member, a coach, or even a teacher's aide. It is important to note that the list of mandatory reporters does not include school volunteers, but this training is recommended for volunteers. For a complete list of all 44 categories, refer to the PDF that can be downloaded from the Resources section of this course by clicking the Resources button on the top right of this player. Under CANRA, a child is defined as anyone under the age of 18. If a child suffers abuse in any of the 4 categories listed, it must be reported. The categories are neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. Neglect occurs when caretakers fail to provide satisfactory emotional and physical care for a child. A recent study investigated over 3.3 million confirmed child abuse reports across the United States, and of these cases, 71% involve neglect. While it's widely accepted as the most common form of child abuse, neglect can be difficult to specifically define since there are no clear minimal standards for adequately meeting a child's mental and physical needs. That said, there are a few different types of neglect that you should be aware of. Physical neglect refers to the failure to provide a child with the basic necessities of life, such as food and clothing. Medical neglect is when caregivers do not meet children's basic health care needs. Mental neglect is failing to provide emotional support, such as emotional security and encouragement. Educational or developmental neglect is the failure to provide a child with experiences for necessary growth and development, such as not sending a child to school or giving him or her an education. Neglect always refers to the living situation of a child. Living with consistent hunger, poor hygiene, not being able to dress appropriately for the weather, and experiencing a lack of supervision all can be the result of neglect. Other signs include a child that might be tired or fatigued because they don't have a roof over their head or a place to sleep. Another sign of neglect is unattended physical, emotional, or medical needs. Neglected children sometimes steal food because they're hungry, beg for money, and they might arrive either early to school or leave late because they do not want to be alone. Neglect can be a result of an affirmative act or from an omission of an act. Not giving a child everything they want, however, is not neglect. Neglect results from our actions or failures to act that results in harm or the threat of harm to both the child's health or welfare. Based on what we suggested earlier, you might imagine situations like a family's house burning down. The child in these circumstances may have lost most of their clothing and may not be bathing as regularly. If a parent or caregiver has died, some of the child's immediate needs may not be paid the same level of attention. Neglect always takes place within the context of a family's own culture and their economic situation. Note that there are agencies, including child welfare services, that may provide assistance and resources to financially troubled families. Your reporting may bring these necessary supports during a time when a family feels alone, is overwhelmed, and not capable of meeting essential needs. Physical child abuse is typically defined as the non-accidental behavior of a caregiver that injures a child. This can include beating, biting, kicking, burning, or otherwise harming a child. While physical abuse is the most visible form of child maltreatment, it can also be difficult to draw the line between physical forms of discipline and physical abuse. As you know, some parents use spanking and other forms of physical punishment as a consequence for a child's behavior. Distinguishing the difference between physical abuse and punishment can be challenging, and the law recognizes that at times this might be a hard distinction to make. Keep in mind that physical punishment is different for every caregiver who chooses to use it. Since these punishments vary in frequency, force, and emotional intensity, each situation must be separately considered. The California Penal Code uses 3 different articles to define physical abuse. The first element involves the willful harming or injuring of a child that endangers them as a person or their health. The second article refers to the unlawful use of corporal punishment in that it was willfully inflicted, resulting in injury or traumatic condition. Finally, if someone intentionally physically injures or causes the death of a child, this is also seen as an act of abuse. Anytime a child tells you that he or she is being physically abused, this is sufficient to create a reasonable suspicion, and you must make a report. Remember, there are different types of injuries, such as pulled out hair resulting in bald spots, and sometimes injuries are in more private parts of the body that are not so easily seen. We also have to take into account developmental considerations in that younger children tend to fall more, and they may have a more difficult time reporting what took place. Sexual abuse is a difficult topic to discuss. Even in families where this is taking place, often the parent of a child is in some level of denial. They find it hard to believe the person they are dating, married to, or are living with is abusing a child. Our stereotypes about offenders makes it more difficult for us to believe that it might be a member of the clergy, banker, a youth group leader, or a relative. Sexual abuse is not always easy to detect because it's hard for us to see the physical marks from inappropriate touching. In the last decade, the sexual exploitation of children, abbreviated SEC, has become an operation for gangs as part of human trafficking that now often produces more income for the gang members than the sale of illegal drugs. This new reality is reflected in the fact that CANRA addresses both sexual assault and sexual exploitation. While there are many definitions of child sexual abuse, it typically includes a wide range of sexual behaviors that take place between a child and someone in a position of power or dominance. Among other things, child sexual abuse may include touching a child's private areas, masturbation, rubbing parts of the child's body, as well as intercourse of any type. There are also forms of sexual abuse that don't involve touch of any kind, such as introducing children to sexual situations or child pornography. Abusers justify or rationalize their actions without consideration for the mental and physical harm to their victims. Another aspect of child sexual abuse is that most victims know and trust their abuser. In fact, sexual abuse by a family friend is much more common than sexual abuse by strangers. And though there are some women abusers, most often men sexually abuse children. Surprisingly, about 1/3 of child abusers are juveniles themselves. Furthermore, although it is a widely held myth, homosexual men are not more likely to sexually abuse children than heterosexual men. Child sexual abuse may have consequences for the child after the abuse is over. The abused child often feels responsible for the abuse. Their shame and guilt makes it more difficult to come forward and report their abuse. Abused children may also fear that others will not believe them, that they'll be made fun of, and that people will blame them. Finally, they worry about losing their families. Knowing this, it is all the more important to take a child seriously when they express a concern or ask for help. And of course, keep in mind that some children may have been frightened by the abuser to not tell anyone. Some of the indicators of child sexual abuse are irrefutable and clear, such as when a child has been infected with a sexually transmitted disease, if there are indications of physical injury to private areas such as tissue damage, or when a child has been identified as depicted in pornography. Although a child disclosing sexual abuse happening is more rare, it may happen. We also know that the inappropriate sexual conduct of a child in the classroom or a playground may be a symptom of the precocious sexuality seen in children with bipolar disorder. This conduct may have been facilitated by inappropriate sexual behavior with peers, having an older sibling that is sharing too much information, or other causes. Remember, you're not an investigator, and the professionals that work in this area understand what is developmentally normal versus something to be concerned about. Words may trigger emotions, thoughts, and actions. They can provide reassurance, comfort, and praise, or just the opposite. They may lead to emotional reactions including fear, sadness, and anger. While we've all heard the nursery rhyme, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," verbal abuse has the potential to emotionally harm a child. Mental or emotional abuse often lowers the child's self-esteem, contributes to depression and self-injury, and interferes with a child's social development. Some forms of mental abuse include making a child feel like he or she is valueless, stupid, good for nothing, or bad. Humiliating, shaming, or demeaning a child. Calling a child damaging names. Comparing a child harshly to others. Yelling, ignoring, or giving a child the silent treatment as punishment. Limiting positive physical contact, such as hugs, kisses, or other activities that show affection. Or putting a child in dangerous situations or hurting others in their presence. Emotional abuse often happens before physical abuse. Harsh words, when combined with a parent or guardian who is intoxicated, too often leads to physical assault. The abusers need to control, and their issues of self-esteem are avoided by blaming others for what they are feeling. Children are influenced by adults, and they may blame themselves for the emotional abuse they are experiencing. Parents who blame their marital or other problems on their children may also be engaging in emotional abuse. Often, emotional abuse is seen in combination with other forms of abuse. Since this form of abuse is difficult to identify, it may take more than one report for the picture to become clear. Based on what we've been discussing, remember, witnessing domestic violence should lead you to suspect emotional abuse and report. As stated earlier, often emotional abuse begins before misconduct escalates to either sexual or physical violence. The early recognition of signs of emotional abuse may disrupt the course of events that often lead to additional harmful behaviors. Bullying, for example, involves the use of emotionally abusive words and statements, whether spoken or sent digitally, that wear down a child's self-esteem. Some of these emotionally damaged students attempt or succeed in committing suicide. Bullies themselves are often abused in their own homes. If you suspect that a child is being bullied, you are obligated to make a report. Another form of emotional abuse is involved when employees, volunteers, or other students use a technique called grooming. Grooming is used to manipulate a student to not resist inappropriate touching. The first stage involves the sharing of secrets with a child or giving a child special gifts. Typically, the victims are told not to tell anyone what has taken place. The person performing the grooming indicates that they are a friend and they care about the child. At this stage, the student often feels special, and in order to receive more rewards, including attention, they remain quiet. In the second stage, the child is informed that they will be blamed if they share what has been discussed or what has taken place. In older students, this threat often means that drug use and pornography by the student will be disclosed. Soon, the student or child is isolated from his family, and their relationships with their peers deteriorate, and they become both frightened and dependent on the person who is manipulating them. The fear, blame, and shame that the child is experiencing is a symptom indicating that this behavior is emotionally abusive. These children may scratch or cut themselves, experience depression, or use drugs as a consequence of the harmful, emotionally abusive effects of grooming. Grooming is a form of emotional abuse and should be reported if suspected. A child may be experiencing emotional abuse or at risk for serious emotional damage if violence, mental illness, and substance abuse is taking place in their home. Mental health symptoms may also be related to the presence of a diagnosable disorder. Unless you're conducting a psychological evaluation of a child as a part of your job, these types of determinations are hard to make. In reaction to experiencing emotional abuse or witnessing violence, a child can suffer from severe anxiety, depression, or withdrawal, or they may harm themselves or act aggressively towards others. The law requires that you report emotional abuse if you have a reasonable suspicion that it is occurring. Remember, a suspicion is just that, suspicion. It does not mean you have to be convinced of abuse before you report it, only that you reasonably suspect abuse. In the first section, we discussed the myths and facts that surround child abuse. We learned that child abuse includes a broad range of behaviors that have no economic, racial, or cultural borders. In the second section, we explored the laws that define and govern child abuse. We reviewed the categories of abuse as defined under California law and CANRA, including neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. We also learned that while any of the forms of child abuse may be found separately, they often occur in combinations. We pointed out that if you have a reasonable suspicion that physical, mental, or sexual harm is occurring to a child, you must make a report to ensure that child's safety. Now, before you proceed to the next section, click the Next button to take a short check on your understanding of the information presented in the first two sections. You now have an understanding of how to recognize when child abuse might be taking place. We will now focus on when you are required to make a report. The Penal Code tells us that if we have actual knowledge of child abuse or reasonably suspect the child is a victim of one or more of the 4 types of abuse mentioned in the previous section, we must report. Remember, actual proof of abuse is not required. The proof will be acquired through investigation by professionals. It is only your duty to report, not investigate. Actual knowledge of child abuse is rare, but obviously, as a mandated reporter, if you have actual knowledge of child abuse, you must report it. But actual knowledge is not required. You are required to report if the facts, as known to you, would lead a reasonable person to suspect child abuse has occurred. If you suspect abuse, report it. What might happen if you fail to report? First, you're potentially endangering the life of a young person. Second, failure to report is a misdemeanor that is punishable by up to 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine. Third, if there is a lawsuit by someone representing the child or another child that was victimized, your failure to act as a mandated reporter may result in your being found financially liable for monetary damages. Finally, if you're a teacher or another professional working in the school, your failure to report may result in the loss of your professional license or teaching credential. As a mandated reporter, your identity is kept confidential. The law tries to safeguard and guarantee your confidentiality to encourage the reporting of abuse or neglect. Law enforcement and child welfare services take the confidentiality of mandated reporters seriously. Often your report will lead to the information that is the basis of a prosecution or plea bargain or other resolution. This is the case because a suspicion typically isn't enough to convict someone. However, there are unusual instances when it is necessary for the district attorney to call a mandated reporter to court as a witness. Although this rarely occurs, it's important to mention this remote possibility. Your identity, however, is likely to be disclosed to official agencies and professionals involved in the investigation, prosecution, or record keeping in these cases. If someone violates your confidentiality, it is a misdemeanor punishable by up to 6 months in county jail or a fine of $500 or both. Your confidentiality is taken seriously. The state recognizes that some suspicions may turn out to be unfounded. However, using the federal law criteria, if in good faith you made your report, you have immunity from both criminal and civil liability. A report not filed in good faith stems from making up facts or acting out of a desire for retaliation and to do harm to the person you are suggesting may be committing abuse. Because the state law recognizes that mandated reporters may be sued, in the event of a lawsuit, the state will provide you up to $50,000 for attorney's fees, even if the court dismisses the action or the mandated reporter prevails. The United States has often been described as a melting pot with people from different cultures, different ethnicities, and belonging to different religions. Culture influences the way a child may be disciplined and how comfortable someone is in talking to someone else who is not a part of their community. However, if the approach to discipline that someone administers or other practices fall within the legal definitions of child abuse as described in this training, it must be reported. A question that is sometimes asked is, who is responsible for filing a mandated report? A mandated reporter cannot assign this responsibility to their employer, supervisor, co-worker, or any other person. Furthermore, just letting a supervisor know is not reporting the incident. If there are 2 or more mandated reporters who jointly suspect child abuse or neglect, then a single report may be filed for all of them. However, if as part of this group you have knowledge that the individual who was going to write the report failed to do so, then you must do so. As a mandated reporter, you need to make the call and ensure the proper report is submitted. So now you're ready to fulfill your obligations as a mandated reporter. If you have a reasonable suspicion abuse has occurred, you should report it immediately or as soon as is practically possible. You need to call the Child Welfare Services or the Child Protective Services hotline. If you feel a child is in immediate danger, you need to contact law enforcement right away. Law enforcement persons such as school resource officers are not authorized to receive child abuse reports. If you report to the wrong organization, you have not fulfilled your mandated reporter obligations. Once you have made your report over the phone, the clock starts ticking and you have 36 hours to complete a written report for Child Protective Services or with a law enforcement agency with whom the telephone report was made. In California, the form that must be completed is the Department of Justice Form 8572, known as Suspected Child Abuse Report, or SCAR. Some counties have this report online. Others require you to download it and fill it out in writing. Fortunately, online you can find instructions to help you complete the form. This form is also available through county welfare departments and local law enforcement agencies and can be downloaded by clicking on the Resources button at the top right-hand side of this player. Take a moment now to obtain this form and then click Next when you're ready to continue. It is important to know that not all reports are investigated. It is possible that you are not the first to report, and incidents may have already been looked into, or there may be additional information that can dispel suspicions. The guiding principle for investigators and mandated reporters alike focuses on the needs of a child victim, which means to do what is necessary in order to prevent abuse. Before the final quiz, we will end this course emphasizing 5 main points. First, as a mandated reporter, you play a critical role in identifying and reporting concerns about both abuse and neglect that might have otherwise gone unreported and unseen. Your mandated reporting protects lives and families. If you have a reasonable suspicion that child abuse or neglect is taking place, you must report. If you're not certain whether to report, you should report. If the story you're hearing seems confusing or implausible, then you should report. Never investigate your suspicions. Finally, you can always call Child Welfare Services or Child Protective Services if you need help in determining if you have a reasonable suspicion. Thank you for helping us share information with you about this serious topic. By paying attention and reporting our suspicions, the consequences for children who are being abused will decrease. Click the next button to start your quiz. You have completed the required training for mandated reporters under AB 1432. You can now close the course window and print your completion certificate.